Now, we've been looking at the people involved in the Jesus story, and you realize there's only one more. She went woo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's what a wife will do. They'll say woo.
Woo.
Woo, we're done. Almost done.
Okay.
So,
I wasn't following that
but
part
be
of it,
that,
so.
but be that as it may. So we've been looking, and we've looked at a lot of different people. And why might it be something important to do, to consider some of these people and groups that were involved in the Jesus story? Why might that be something worthwhile for Christians to do?
It enhances the setting
Okay.
and the understanding of the individuals.
It enhances the setting and understanding. How might it do that? How might it enhance the setting?
Gives you background on what's going on.
Okay, we get a little bit more background about what's going on in the story. All right. So it certainly enhances. What else does it? Why else might it be helpful to know some of these characters, individuals, and groups in the gospel story? It certainly enhances the story. What else?
Mm-hmm.
What are some other things it might do? Knowing this.
We can learn from them.
Okay, we can learn from the individuals. For instance, we've looked at a whole bunch of them. What are some of the things we can learn from some of the folks that we've looked at?
Well, John the Baptist baptized Jesus, but he was sinless, so there were really no sins to be forgiven.
Uh-huh. All right, so that becomes kind of and one of those interesting things that when you look at the Gospels, the different evangelists kind of deal with in their own way. You know, how do we have Jesus baptized when baptism is associated with sin, but we believe Jesus was sinless? And the different evangelists kind of deal with that in different ways. So that would be good. What else? What other examples do we see that we might apply in some of these characters?
Well, like the women at the tomb, rather than just pulling information to ourselves to share it with others.
Okay. Right from the Gospel of Mark, when they went from the tomb and didn't tell anybody. So that can be almost a negative example. This is what we don't want to do. Okay? What else as you look at some of these characters?
Don't be like the Pharisee.
Okay. Why? I mean, what was the problem with the Pharisees?
They were not very gracious and were very law-abiding.
Okay. Not very gracious, very law-abiding. Okay. So we might want to avoid that example. What else? Anything else? Any other examples? Because we've looked at a mess of them. I'm looking at a list. Looked at John the Baptist. We looked at Mary, the mother of Jesus, Nicodemus, Mary Magdalene, Peter, Matthew and the tax collectors, John, Thomas, Philip, and the rest of the apostles, Judas, the Scribes and the Pharisees, the Herods, and then last week we looked at Pilate and the Romans. So can you think of any other ways that these people can serve as an example?
Well, Peter's saying that he would, fight for Jesus and not, he would always be there for him, and then he turns around and denies
Okay.
the knowledge of Christ. So
And what can we do with that example? What do you think we could do with that example?
if you say you're going to do something,
Okay.
do it.
That if you say you're going to fight for somebody, you
Really stand there for it instead of saying,
Yeah.
I don't know who he was.
okay. So that
But it was probably self-preservation too,
okay.
to some degree.
I think that's probably right. And what can we pick up from that? If Peter did it to protect himself, especially the denial. Good gracious, when he denies him.
That were sinful.
Okay, that we're sinful, and even Peter,
Right.
the great Peter,
The rock.
the rock,
He slipped.
can be more like a pebble, sometimes more like a little pebble.
We should associate ourselves with the lowly.
Okay.
Not be afraid to be like with the tax collectors and
okay, that they have value, that they have value
The
to.
Gentiles.
And Gentiles, which we all are. Okay, so we've
Kinda
got,
back in the day.
back in the day,
When, who was it? Was it Paul or was it Peter that like changed seats or,
Peter
yeah.
in Galatians
So he
changed.
wasn't being very accepting.
He wasn't being very accepting, and the Apostle Paul was quick to point that out to Peter when he called him a hypocrite. So that wasn't a very good thing. Okay, so we've looked at all these people, and it certainly fleshes out the story, and they provide in their own way positive and negative examples. And like I said, we've got 2 more to do, and both of them are more like groups. And tonight we're going to be looking at the crowds, and next week, although we talk a little bit about the rich young ruler more as an example, we'll look at people of wealth, because they play a role in the story, and they might be able to teach us something, flesh out what's going on. Okay, now the crowds, and I don't know if I've mentioned it to y'all, but I have in other groups. The crowds play a role in all 4 of the Gospels, but particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, the word crowd in Greek is aklos. That's the Greek word for crowd. And in the English translation, that's always translated crowd. And so when in Greek you've got this one noun that refers to the group, that's what we see in the English. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at the crowd in the gospel in general, and then we're going to look at some specific characteristics of the crowd and talk a little bit about that. And then we'll have one more to go. So looking at the crowds in general, the crowd is one of, and like I said on your little sheet here, the crowd is one of the groups represented in the gospel. Now that seems like a duh statement. What are some of the other groups that play a role in the gospel? Now remember, the gospels are written as biographies. They are gospels, good news. And the evangelists are shaping it like a writer would shape a story, or a writer actually would shape a biography. The biographies aren't just lists of facts. The writer shapes it into something that has meaning. And as good writers, all the evangelists have different groups. And what are some of the groups? And the crowds are one group. What are some of the other groups we've encountered as we've talked about the Gospels?
Scribes and Pharisees.
Okay, we've talked about the scribes and the Pharisees. And as you think about the scribes and the Pharisees, who were they? Who were the scribes and the Pharisees?
Religious leaders and scribes were like the ones who read the scripture to the crowds.
Scribes and Pharisees seem to be the big group. Who might we also kind of include with scribes and Pharisees that we've encountered as we've read the story? Although scribes and Pharisees are mentioned over and over and over again, who would be some other groups, Jewish leaders, that would be included maybe with the scribes and the Pharisees?
I can't think of the name right now. Scribes, Pharisees. You mean the temple worship? No, those are Pharisees. The temple worships?
Well, the guys around the temple, and they were called Sadducees.
Oh, sorry.
So they would be part of it. And we've talked about priests, the high priests, and that would all be in this group. And what does this group play in the story? In the Jesus story? What does this particular group, what role does it play?
The temple worship is it?
Okay, they're all focused on temple worship, or worship, Jewish worship. In fact, in the Gospel of John, often they're called the Jews. You don't even break them into smaller groups within Judaism. They are the Jews.
But then you had the Romans too.
Okay, hold on the Romans just a little bit. So we've got these scribes and Pharisees. What role are they playing in the story? If you wanted to identify, because all of these gospel stories are written like stories. What role do these scribes and Pharisees and high priests and Sadducees and even Herodians maybe, what role do they play in the story?
Well, they show off.
Okay, they show off. So, okay, good. What else? They certainly show off. What else?
They don't practice what they preach.
They don't practice what they preach. What else?
They don't lift a finger to ease any of the burdens.
Okay,
of people.
they don't help the people,
So,
but they follow the law. They're big on the law. Okay, so if you look at the role they're playing, is this a positive role that they're playing in the gospel story?
not really.
No, wouldn't appear to be. And what may be, so the example of the scribes and the Pharisees would be the example not to follow. John gets a little tricky because Nicodemus is a Pharisee that changes. But especially when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Pharisees don't change very much. They tend to be all negative examples. What else makes them negative? So their lifestyle, their examples, their following of the law and imposing things on the people, that's negative. They're kind of hypocrites, which is negative. They apply things to people, but they don't apply it to themselves. What may be the biggest problem with the scribes and the most negative thing about scribes and Pharisees?
I'm trying to get Jesus, killed off.
Okay, they're trying to get Jesus. And do you remember why they're trying to get Jesus? Why they decide early on, certainly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, early on they decide, we got to get rid of this guy. Why?
He's performing things on the Sabbath.
Okay, he's performing things on the Sabbath, and what's really interesting when you look at those stories, especially the one that becomes the issue that breaks, that separates Jesus, that causes them to say, we got to get rid of him, is when he healed a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath that we talked about. Something that,
urgent.
What's that?
It wasn't urgent.
That it wasn't urgent, but he did it anyway. And he said to him directly, should you do good or evil on the Sabbath? And they wouldn't answer. And then Jesus chooses to do good. And the scribes and the Pharisees, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's at that point they decide, we're going to kill him. So the evangelists are shaping this to make the scribes and the Pharisees look really bad. Because they're going to kill Jesus not because he's breaking the law. They're going to kill him ultimately because he's choosing to do good, which makes them very bad. So that's one group. So we're going to talk about the crowds. We got group scribes and Pharisees. If we want to look on the goodness scale, really good and really bad, where would we put the scribes and the Pharisees? Really bad. They're really bad. Who else do we have in the story? What other groups? What's that?
The Romans.
Okay, we got the Romans in the story. And what role do the Romans play?
They tore down the temple because the Jews rebelled.
Okay, they end up tearing down the temple. In the Gospels, how are they presented? How do the evangelists present the Romans and Pontius Pilate?
Not so bad.
Okay.
They were peace-loving. They just wanted the taxes paid and no war.
Okay, they're peace-loving. They just want taxes paid. They don't want war. Would you put them with the scribes and the Pharisees?
No.
No. But they're the ones that killed Jesus, right?
No.
So, you're shaking your head. Why wouldn't they be the ones who kill him?
Because they didn't think there was a reason for him to be killed.
Okay, so they don't think there's a reason to kill him. Well, why do they end up killing him? Because he dies on a Roman cross.
Because of the Jews.
Okay, because the Jews. We'll talk a little bit about that today with the crowds. But the Jewish, what part of the Jews? Scribes and Pharisees, chief priests. They're the ones that cause it, not the Romans. So the Romans aren't horrible. Where would they be on that spectrum? From good to bad. Really good to really
In
bad.
the middle.
They're kind of somewhere in the middle. Why aren't they on the on the good side?
Because they still want to uphold the law and, maybe don't make it so easy on them.
Okay, and do they follow Jesus? Are the Romans
Yeah.
followers? Are they Christians? No, the Romans aren't Christians. They're just fair. They're just people. So they're not here, because the Jews, these guys are horrible. But they're not over here either. So we've got Scribes and Pharisees, we've got Romans. What other group do we have? Other groups.
Apostles.
Okay, we got apostles, and apostles are a subgroup of something a little bigger. Because remember, we said apostles by the name means sent out. So apostles are sent out. Now, they're part of a bigger group.
The disciples.
Okay, disciples. And disciples are people who
Follow.
follow and learn. Now, who were the disciples?
Bunch of men.
Okay, a bunch of men. Well, just men?
Well, it kind of shows that Mary Magdalene was
Yeah,
a
Mary
follower.
Magdalene and some of those other in Luke. Some of the others that was
Doesn't
supporting
really
them.
get any billing for it. They're just a background.
They are not part of the top 12.
No.
They don't break that glass ceiling. Okay, so we've got disciples, apostles as part of them. And what role are the disciples playing in the story? What role do they play?
Follow Jesus.
They're learners.
Okay, they follow Jesus, they're learners. Now, if we want to put it on this spectrum, bad, good, where are we going to put the disciples?
Good.
We're going to put them on the good side, all the way on the good side, as far as you can go?
Not all of
No.
them.
Why wouldn't we put them as far as we could go?
Because Judas blew it.
Yeah, Judas pretty much blew it. So if we take Judas out, they are all good.
Peter's.
Ooh, Peter betrayed.
Yeah.
Yeah, but outside of Peter and Judas,
Oh, they're human. We
yeah,
all make mistakes.
there's a humanity to them.
Yeah.
Why do you think that even though they're on this good side here, they're not all the way on the extreme? Certainly they aren't as good as the scribes and the Pharisees are bad. I mean, they are bad all the time, all the way. Why do you think the evangelists don't portray the disciples as being extremely good? Pure good. Pure goodness.
It's that human factor.
Okay,
So
so
you can deny. You say you won't deny it, but then you do. It's self-preservation, and it's that human factor that we all blow it at some point.
okay, so why do you think that would be important for the evangelists to include? To have that presentation of the disciples, their humanity.
Makes us realize when we screw up. Hey.
Okay, it
It makes us
makes.
feel so bad.
Yeah.
Gives us something to push towards.
Okay, all right. So we've got disciples, we've got scribes and Pharisees, we've got Romans. Any other groups running around in the story that we encounter?
Tax collector.
Okay, we got sinners and tax collectors, and what is their who are they?
Matthew.
Okay, Matthew is an example of a tax collector. Who are these sinners and tax collectors?
Well, they're trying to do right.
They're worthy of redemption. They're
Oh.
not well liked.
Okay, so if you ask somebody in their society with this, kind of spectrum, the good and bad, where are they going to put the sinners and tax collectors? If you ask somebody in first century Judea,
They put them in the bad side.
they put them on the bad side. Okay, in fact, they probably put the scribes and the Pharisees on the good side because they were pretty moral people. But in the Gospels, are the sinners and tax collectors on the bad side?
Not Jesus' eyes.
No, not in Jesus'
No
eye.
one is out of the scope of redemption.
Okay, nobody is outside of the scope. In fact, Jesus eats with them, but he also eats with the scribes and the Pharisees. So we've got the sinners and tax collectors there. They're kind of in the middle, right?
Maybe further on than the Romans, yeah.
Yeah,
Better side.
a little better. So if we have the Romans here, midpoint here, we got the Romans here, we put the sinners and tax collectors here. Okay. Who else do we have? Do we have anybody else in this story?
Oh, Judas who betrayed him.
Okay, we got Judas, and where are we going to put Judas? He's kind of tricky.
He tried, but
Yeah, I mean, depends on which gospel you look at, because if you look at the gospel of John, he's a thief, but Satan enters him. If you look at the gospel of Mark, he betrays him, and that's it. But if you look at in the gospel of Luke, he betrays him and suffers consequences. But Matthew, he takes the money back and kind of repents, and so he's not quite as bad in Matthew as he is in the other three.
But he was fulfilling prophecy, so
Yes,
that makes him more righteous in that way.
which and also complicates it, because it's hard to hold him accountable when he is doing what?
I have a ringer on my phone. I'm sorry.
Evidently.
What's that?
I said I have a ringer on my phone?
Yeah.
I've never heard that before.
That's pretty exciting. Yeah, almost sounds like heaven. All right, so we've got
I'm
the...
leaving. Much excitement.
Yeah. As long as other people heard it, I feel comfortable. If I'm the only one hearing little tones,
Did you
then
hear
I'm going to start
something?
worrying.
Did you hear something?
Yeah, I heard
He's
it.
hearing things.
Yeah, yeah.
That comes after boldness. Like here.
Yeah, our brains are being exposed to climate change. All right, now we've got all of these different groups and individuals. Now the evangelists are writing stories, right? They're writing stories to the audience, and when they use like disciples, how do they want their audience, which includes us, how do they want us to respond? When we're reading the gospel, or we're hearing someone read the gospel, and we see Jesus said to the disciples, how do you think they want us to respond as the audience?
Like that they're talking to us.
Okay, why might we feel that they're talking to us?
Because we're followers.
Okay, we would identify with disciples. And when we get a little story about a scribe or a Pharisee, as soon as they're mentioned, how do you think the evangelist want the audience to
Maybe
react?
in the background.
Okay, they're kind of a boo, because they're going to do something nasty in it. When we see sinners and tax collectors, how are we supposed to react?
Well,
You want to think you're better than them.
Okay, might think we're better, but you were saying, well,
I mean, some people might see him as bad, but others might see him as, comparable to us having sin as well.
in the Gospels themselves, do sinners and tax collectors ever prove to be really bad? Can you think of any story, any passage, anything in the Gospels where sinners and tax collectors act like society thinks they should act? I can't think of one. That they're always, even though they're there, and they end up not being bad in the story. Now, other than Matthew, they don't follow,
No.
but they're not
Bad.
They're not terrible. We don't boo when we see a sinner and tax collector. In fact, we kind of expect something positive to come out of the encounter. In fact, like Zacchaeus, and Matthew, they become positive figures. Okay, so in each of these cases, the evangelist want us to react in certain ways. Now, as we look at, and that shapes the way we read the material. As we deal with as we deal with the crowds, and that becomes another group, and we'll talk about where they'll lie. The crowds are presented as a single, like, identity. I call it collective. And what does that mean? If we say the crowds are viewed as a single collective, what do you think I have in mind by using the word collective?
A group.
Okay, and in that group, the evangelists don't talk about individuals in the group, they talk about
Group itself.
the group. Therefore, in this group, everybody
It's painted with the same paintbrush.
painted with the same paintbrush. Now, why might the evangelists do that? So we don't have like individuals in the crowd.
Well, it kind of makes it a consensus, so whenever they say, who do you want us to release, they all say Barabbas
Okay.
instead of Jesus. So they all agreed on whatever.
So it's not like 50% say this or 80% say this and 20%. It's either all or nothing. Now, going back again, why would the evangelists do that? Again, they're shaping their story. Certainly, historically, the crowd didn't all walk together. They didn't all say the same thing. That's not how people work. Why would the evangelists choose to present them in that way?
They were all going with the same answer. I mean, they were pretty much united in what they were saying.
Okay, so there's a unity. How do you think? We said with each of the other groups we've talked about, the writer tended to want us to see that or either identify with that group or react to that group in a certain way as we read the story. How do you think the evangelists want us to respond to the crowds?
I guess favorably or negatively, depending on the situation.
Okay, so our response to the crowds may be positive or negative depending on, and it's the whole crowd, depending on the situation. In the story, in the gospel, so we've got the crowds are one of the groups that the evangelists use. They're dealt with as a single group. I mean, we don't even have, like you have Matthew and Zacchaeus among the Scribes and Pharisees. You got Pontius Pilate among the Romans, and Festus and Felix in Acts. We got different Herods. So they're broken up. The disciples have it, but you don't have any breakup of the crowds. The crowds are always the crowds. We don't even have chief priests like Caiaphas and Annas. They are always the crowds. They always think alike. They always act as
It's like a
a
political
whole.
party.
It's like a political party where everybody has the exact same opinion. There is no nuance at all. There are no edges to it. And in the stories, the crowds will change. In all of the Gospels, the crowds will change. And how might you expect the crowds to change? As the Gospel story goes on, how might you expect, if you didn't know the stories themselves, how might you expect the crowds to change?
Lose momentum or gain momentum.
Okay, might lose momentum, and why might they lose momentum? What might cause the crowds to lose momentum?
If they're not on the same page as the rest of the crowd.
Okay, if something's happening that causes them to question the direction they were moving,
Yeah.
might cause them to lose momentum. Do crowds ever lose momentum? Groups ever lose momentum?
Sure.
What are some things that cause groups to lose momentum?
Lack of organization.
Okay, not organized, and a crowd is not well organized. What else can cause a big group to lose momentum?
When they find out the person's lying.
Okay, you find out stuff about
Whoever they're following.
Yeah, whoever you're following finds out that they got feet of clay, or they're saying things you don't like anymore. What might cause, so that could cause them to lose momentum. What might cause them to gain momentum?
They're excited about the cause.
Okay, they get more excited. And what would be some things that would get them excited about the cause?
Maybe their viewpoints are being heard. Or
Okay. Okay. So that could get them fired up about what
Well,
they're
like
doing.
when Jesus was performing miracles and, casting out demons, that might have made them more excited and engaged.
So we'd expect them to become more interested as Jesus is performing miracles and giving them food, free food. What might Jesus do that would dampen their enthusiasm? What do you think he could do that would dampen their momentum?
Well, I think what next week's thing's gonna be, somebody wealthy trying to get them to sell everything and follow them.
So if he starts talking about stuff that they don't want to hear, that could dampen their enthusiasm. Selling everything they have. What else could he say that would do that very thing that they wouldn't want to hear?
No, you shouldn't be worshiping idols whenever
Okay.
he calls them.
Shouldn't be worshiping idols. That could cause them, especially if they're doing that, would dampen their enthusiasm. What else? Do you think would dampen the enthusiasm of any crowd?
I think towards the end, when they think that he's not going to be with them anymore, it kind of frightens them.
Okay. If Jesus starts talking about having to go, leave, that may not fire them up. That may cause them to go a little bit down. Okay, so they're going to change in the story, and we're going to see that in just a little bit. Now, these are just general things about the crowd. Specifically, going to highlight a few things specifically about the crowds as they're covered in the Gospels. And what we're going to look at is we're going to only look at the Gospel of Matthew, even though the crowds are mentioned a lot in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'm using Matthew because what he writes in his Gospel seems to be more complete, certainly than Matthew, and even a little bit more than Luke in dealing with the crowds. Understand Matthew, Mark, and Luke are viewing the crowds in just about the same way. All right, now I've got down as the first bullet point having to do with the crowds. The crowd was present but not called. And I'm going to read to you this passage, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. And it's from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, 18 through 25. If you want to turn to it, that'd be fine. This is what Matthew writes. As he walked, and when he says he, who's he talking about?
Jesus.
Jesus, okay. As Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As they went from there, they saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. And he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Now this is now the next verse, verse 23. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, people possessed by demons or having epilepsy or afflicted with paralysis, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. And we've got a little contrast, right? We've got a group at the beginning, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, who were called, and then we have the crowds that are following but haven't been called. What would be the difference between being called, the the Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and these crowds that are described in verse 25. Great crowds followed him from Galilee. What would be the difference between being called and just kind of being around?
I think the ones that are called are more active. He wants them to kind of replace him when he's gone.
Okay, so the ones called are going to be more active to replace him. What would then they be doing if they when they replace him?
Healing, teaching.
Okay, healing, teaching. Okay, why would they be doing that?
Because the Holy Spirit will win.
Okay, because we've got Holy Spirit involved. Now that's the Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and the other disciples, other apostles. How is that different than the crowds that are mentioned in 25 after Jesus is proclaiming and teaching and proclaiming in synagogues and healing and doing all this kind of stuff?
They're just spectators right now.
Okay, they're spectators. What does that say about motivation? Why are they following?
Because they're curious, interested.
Okay, they're curious, they're interested.
Maybe excited, maybe on awe.
Okay, so their motivations aren't the same as those who are called. Those who are called are motivated by things that are slightly different. Now, it's kind of interesting. I think this contrast here that Matthew writes about in the 4th chapter between those who are called and and the crowds, and understand they're both following, right? I mean, Peter, Andrew, James, and John are following Jesus, and so are the crowds, but what you're saying is their motivation is different, and their perspective on who Jesus is, even at this early point, is slightly different. And a little bit later in the gospel, we might have an idea of what Matthew is talking about in a parable and an explanation he gives in chapter 13. And we're talking about chapter 13, 1 through 9 and 18 through 23. So again, if you want to turn to Matthew 13, you can do that. And this is a parable we've heard and we probably talked about before. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there where the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, now, right here, to whom is Jesus telling this parable?
The crowds.
Okay, he's telling it to the crowd. The same group that earlier was there when Jesus was teaching and proclaiming and doing miracles and healing and all. Okay, this is the parable. He says to them, listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came and ate them up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and thorns grew up and choked them. Other seed fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. If you have ears, hear. Okay, that's the parable. And then 18, so we've got a little break in verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. And by the way, when Jesus starts talking in verse 18, to whom is he talking?
God. Oh, us.
In the gospel, who does he say he's talking to?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were saying, who's he talking about?
Because he says, you said in verse 1, he's talking to crowds, right?
Uh-huh.
He tells the parable to the crowd. In verse 18, he's going to start explaining the parable. Does he explain it to the crowd?
To us, I guess.
Who does it say he's talking to in verse 18? Now you may have to go back and look at verse 10, that gap between verse 10 and verse 18, to find out to whom he's talking.
And disciples?
Okay, so in verse 18, he's telling the disciples. So the parable he gives to the crowds, but verse 18, he's talking to the disciples, not the crowds. And this is what he says. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of this age and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is one who hears the word and understands it, and who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, in another 30. Now, for one, Jesus is giving the parable to the crowds, right? Mm-hmm. But what is he giving to the disciples?
What it means.
What it means. He's giving an explanation to the disciples. Now, what does that suggest about the crowd? If the crowd hears the parable, but it's only the disciples that hears what the parable means, what does that suggest to you about the crowds? Or at least the way the evangelists are presenting the crowd to their audience, to the reader, to us. How does that shape the way we see the crowds?
They're not as smart.
What's that?
They might not be as smart.
They may not be. Well, is it a matter of smartness, being smart?
Understanding.
Okay, certainly has to do with understanding. Mm-hmm. Because a crowd may be as smart as the disciples, right? But what's the difference?
The disciples need to know how to differentiate among people.
Okay, they know what it means, right? Mm-hmm. And you think about the field itself. How might that reflect at least Jesus' understanding of the crowds? Even though the crowds don't act as individuals, they act as a group. What might this suggest about the crowds, this parable of the sower in a field?
They're just playing a secondary role.
Okay, they're playing a secondary role because they don't have the explanation. Might this explanation that Jesus gives his disciples, might that reflect on the nature of the crowds themselves? In other words, within the crowd, there are people, because remember, they're not following yet. They're just there. Might there be people in the crowds who are like paths? Mm-hmm. Who hear and don't read? Might there be people in the crowds that are like seed planted in shallow soil? Mm-hmm. That are all excited but don't have much depth? People in the crowd that might be like soil that has weeds in it, that gets choked out by other things, but also people in the crowd who
Good soil.
Are good soil and are productive. So this parable, not only does this parable reflect the difference in the story between the crowds and the disciples, because the disciples know. And remember, we said to Matthew's audience, they're identifying with disciples, right? The crowds, they're not identifying with the crowds. The crowds are somebody else, right? Mm-hmm. That maybe the crowds are what you're going to find in the field, okay? Are the ones out there that are made up of good soil and soil that is not quite as good. Now, so we've got the crowds were present, but they weren't called. They weren't disciples. Something else about the crowds. They were present. The crowd was present when Jesus taught, healed, cast out demons, and performed miracles. For example, with the healing from Matthew 15, and you don't have to because we're going to be hitting these. Great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the maimed, the mute, and many others. They put them at his feet, and he cured them. so that the crowd was amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the lame hold, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Okay, so they were there at the healings. They were there when demons were cast out, as it says in Matthew 12. Then they brought out to him a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute, and he cured him, so that the one who had been mute could speak and see. All the crowds were amazed and were saying, "Can this be the son of David?" But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "It is only by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons, that this man casts out demons." Okay, a little contrast between what's going on with the crowds and what's going on with the scribes and the Pharisees. They're there with miracles. Matthew 14. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there to in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the crowds came to him and said, or the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so they may go to the village and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave it to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. So they were there at miracles. Example of the crowds being there at miracles. And finally the teaching, and we already saw that with Matthew 13, the parable. The same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him. He got into a boat and sat there, and while the whole crowd stood on the beach, he told them many things in parables, saying. Okay, so we've got the crowds present as Jesus is doing all these things. Mm-hmm. Why is it significant? Now, understand, Matthew and Mark and Luke are doing the same thing. Why is it significant that as Matthew writes this down, he makes sure we, the reader, know that the crowds are there? I mean, understand, Matthew doesn't have to say this, that the crowds, and in some of these, he repeats crowds a couple of times, as though to make sure we know that it's the oikos, the crowds, that are there. Why might it be important that he has the crowds present at these times when Jesus is doing these great things?
Showing that a lot of people witnessed it.
Okay, showing that there are witnesses. And why would witnesses be important? Why might that be important to the story, that there are witnesses? What's that?
Verification.
Okay, you got verification, which means he actually did it, right? Okay, significant because it actually happened. Why else might it be significant? That the evangelist makes sure we know the crowds are there when he's doing this stuff.
Well, if there was only 5 or 6 of them, they wouldn't need that much bread and fish.
Okay, so it makes the miracle even more spectacular. And not only did he feed the whole crowd, and he's going to do it later with 4,000, there was leftovers enough to fill 12 baskets, which sounds to me like a important number. 12, not 11 baskets, not 13, but 12. In each of these situations where the crowds are seeing Jesus or hearing Jesus, how do they react?
Amazed.
They are amazed, they're in awe, they're astonished every single time. What does that show about the crowd? That they are astonished, they're amazed, they're in awe.
Paying attention?
Okay, the crowds are paying attention, certainly. What else?
Well, they're starting to realize that he's he's someone important.
Okay, they realize he's someone pretty important. Okay. Even at the beginning it said that's why they were there, when he was doing this stuff. And the crowds followed him around when he did it.
Well, think about as you're an eyewitness to something, and the more you tell it, a lot of times it gets more embellished.
Okay.
And, if you could say, no, I was there and I saw there was 12 baskets of leftovers.
Okay. You avoid that, what is it, the telephone game?
Telephone game.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
You avoid that. Okay, so we've got the crowds are witness. Now, is there a difference between being astonished and being faithful? Is there a difference between amazement and faith?
Absolutely.
Okay, what would be the difference between being astonished and being faithful? Believing.
Being astonished, you're just awe. You just, wow, I can't believe that happened.
Okay.
But being faithful means that a lot of times it means you believe it without having to see it.
Okay. Kind of like it says in Hebrews, that faith is the assurance of things that aren't seen.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. And who is it that comes closer? They don't have it yet, but comes close to faith. Which of the groups in the story we've talked about comes closest to having faith? They don't have it yet, but they're close.
You know about the disciples?
Okay, the disciples are close. Why don't they have it yet? Why aren't the disciples able to believe? They all believe that Jesus was the Christ, but they have trouble with the Son of Man. Why aren't they at faith yet?
Because they're Jewish?
Well, they're Jewish, okay. That certainly gets in the way. What else? Why don't the disciples in the Gospels themselves express faith? Especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's a little different, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why aren't they able to express faith? What happens at the end of the Gospel?
I think it's the Holy Spirit.
Okay, well, Holy Spirit, we got, well, yeah.
After
Holy,
crucifixion and
that's,
so forth.
that's right. We got a crucifixion at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
Holy Spirit's going to come after the crucifixion.
And the disciples don't have that yet.
And the disciples don't have that
So
yet.
they just think only Jesus can do that stuff. They're not expecting that they'll be able to do it just by their shadow passing over people.
Okay, so they don't know the end of the story.
Right.
In the Gospel, not only do they not have the Holy Spirit, they don't even know about crucifixion, right? And they don't know about,
Ascension.
what's that?
Ascension.
Ascension.
Resurrection.
And they don't know about resurrection. So they don't know that, therefore they can't have faith because they're not at the end of the story yet. Okay, so they can't have, but they're a whole lot closer than just being amazed. Because even the Pharisees, it said, were amazed. They just didn't like it. And it's interesting when you think about the crowds, what Matthew writes in, again, the 13th chapter. Remember, we looked at the parable, and there was something in between it. And I think that is really pertinent because it explains why the disciples get an explanation, and the crowds just get a parable. Jesus said, this is what Matthew writes. Then the disciples came and asked him, why do you speak to them, the crowds, in parables? Jesus answered, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to those who have more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. The reason I speak to you in parables is that seeing they don't perceive, and hearing they don't listen, nor do they understand. With them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah that says, you will indeed listen but never understand, and you will indeed look but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their eyes are hard of hearing. And they have shut their eyes so that they might not look with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for you see, and your ears, for you hear. Truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Now, according to Jesus, why did he teach parables to the crowds? Which again, I think explains how the writer wants us to see the crowds. What does Jesus say is the reason he taught the crowds parables?
So it's understandable to them.
What's that?
So it's understandable to them.
Now, that's usually what we think, right? That he talked in a parable, a story, because we like stories, and talked about agricultural stories, and they're farmers. But I want you to notice that that's not what Jesus said. When the disciples said to him, the disciples came to him and say, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" He answered, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven." In other words, who has received the secrets of the kingdom of heaven?
The apostles.
The apostles, the disciples, right? And what is he just about ready to do with the disciples? After this, he's going to give them an explanation of the parable, right? He's going to tell them what it means. Now, but to them, so he said, "To you would be given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven." But to them, and who's the them?
The crowd.
The crowds. But to them it has not been given. For to those who have, more will be given, and those who have, and they will have in abundance. But for those who have nothing, what will be given is taken away. The reason I speak to them is the crowds in parables, is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. Why is Jesus giving parables to the crowds? Why is he teaching them in parables? In other words, why does he not teach them a parable and then say, "Crowds, before you go, let me give you the explanation"? Because if he gives them the explanation, then what? They'll understand what the parable means, something he does for the disciples. Why doesn't he do that with the crowds?
So the disciples can be the leaders.
Okay,
followers.
so the disciples know and will be leaders, and the crowds
Can wonder.
won't know. He teaches them in parables so that they don't
Quite
understand.
Yeah. Well, it's
He-
like the prodigal son.
Okay?
Well, what about the one that was left behind and did all the work the whole time?
Uh-huh.
So they don't say about him. It's just the one that comes back that gets all the attention.
Okay. So it's the crowds don't know. And in fact, without the explanation, the crowds can't know. They're going to be clueless. Now, remember, this is all Matthew communicating to his congregation, right? This is all communicating to them. What is he telling them about disciples? And you said earlier that disciples, the people in Matthew's church, are going to see themselves as disciples, right? That's why they're in the church and not outside. What is he saying, suggesting about those disciples, those people in the church? That they have something that the crowds don't have. They have something that people on the outside don't have, because they have an explanation, right? They have Holy Spirit. They have something that the people outside don't have. And what is it suggesting about the people on the outside? They don't have it.
They're not gonna fully get it until they explore it.
Okay, they don't have it until God does something with them.
They won't get it.
They're not going to get there unless the explanation is given, unless the Spirit is given. They are never going to get it. Okay? Really an important lesson. So, Matthew's church, you're a group of disciples. You understand. You understand who Jesus was. You understand why he died. You understand the significance of the resurrection. You understand his teachings. But the people you encounter in the world don't, and at this point, can't. Okay, important lesson. Okay, so we've got the crowds, although the crowds are there during these important events, they're not getting it. And that kind of explains why at the end, and the third bullet point, the crowds called for the crucifixion. The crowds called for the crucifixion. Matthew 28:15 through 23. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time they had a notorious prisoner named Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to him, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" And they said, who is they? The crowds. They said Barabbas. Pilate said to them, the crowds, "Then what should I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" All of them, the crowds, said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." Now, what's the situation in this passage?
Deciding who's going to be set free and who's going to be...
Deciding who's going to be set free and who's not. Pilate, and like you said earlier, Pilate on that spectrum is, and the Romans are somewhere sort of in the middle. Okay? What does Pilate choose to do?
Let the crowd decide.
Let the crowds decide, right? Good politician thing to do, right? You know, not a very strong thing, but as a good politician, let the people choose. And what was the choice the people made?
To free Barabbas and crucify Jesus.
Okay, they choose to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. Why do they do that? Why does Matthew tell us, the reader, they did that? Why do the crowds choose Barabbas? Choose to free Barabbas and choose to crucify Jesus?
They were prompted by the higher-ups.
Okay, the higher-ups, the ones that are over here, are kind of pushing them to do what they do. Ultimately, what does the crowd want? What does the crowd want?
Barabbas to be freed and Jesus to be crucified.
Okay, and what does it show about the crowd? Now remember, the crowd in the past, what was the crowd's attitude towards Jesus?
Amazing.
They were in awe, they were amazed, but
now the crowd's turned into a mob.
And now the crowd's turned into a mob. The same crowd
Because there's the influencers.
is now, there's an influence. When you look at the beginning earlier on, and the crowds were in awe, were they being influenced?
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah.
What caused them to be in awe?
Because
See
of
in the
what they were
first
seeing
one.
and experiencing.
What's that?
Because of what they were
Because of what they were experiencing, right?
Right.
So, who was influencing them then?
Jesus.
Jesus was influencing them. That's why they followed him, right? Matthew said they followed him because of what he said, because of what he did. They followed him, right? He influenced them. Who's influencing them now?
Pharisees.
Scribes and Pharisees are influencing them. Early on, Jesus influenced them to follow. Here, they influenced him, the same crowd, to ask for his crucifixion. What does that show about the crowd?
They're influenced.
Okay, good. They're really easily influenced. The crowd is really easily influenced. Now, you went like this.
Flip-flopping.
They're flip-flopping, right? They tend to be kind of wishy-washy, right? So the crowd doesn't have anything solid. They tend to flow with whomever is talking to them. Now, that's how the crowds are presented in the Gospels. Like I said, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So what role are these crowds, as we kind of bring this together, what role did these crowds play in the Gospel story? What role are they playing here? What is their role? Why?
Influencer.
What's that?
Influence.
Okay, are they influencers?
Instigators.
Are they instigators? Are they
Influencees.
influencees? What do you mean by influencees?
They are the result of being influenced by other people.
They're the result of being influenced by other people. You know, they aren't the instigator, they're the instigatees. They're the ones that the instigators are stirring up, right? And even if you look at Jesus as an instigator, and in a way he is, because instigators change things. You know, the crowds follow him. In fact, in the Gospels, there are points where, near the end, the scribes and the Pharisees want to arrest Jesus, but don't arrest him, because they're afraid of the crowds. They're afraid of the crowds. And yet, a chapter later, they've influenced the crowds to cry for his crucifixion. Now, that's who the crowds are in the Gospels. Now, again, these evangelists are writing to churches. They're writing to disciples. They aren't writing to the crowds. They're writing to disciples. Why is it important that for these evangelists to have the disciples in their church to view the crowds in that way? Who are the crowds for these evangelists writing to their audience? Or what people do you think they want their church, their disciples, to view living around the turn of the first century? For them, who are the crowds?
Now or then?
Well, I was going to get to now.
I think that they consider them the ones who caused Jesus' death.
Okay, caused Jesus' death. Well, that's very interesting. If you look at the story the way Matthew writes it, who really causes Jesus' death? If you took them out of the picture, Jesus wouldn't have been crucified.
No, because it's fulfilling prophecy.
Right. But if you take one group out of the picture, this wouldn't have happened the way it did.
You'd have to take the crowd out.
Well, if you took the crowd out, it wouldn't. Well, did the crowd act on its own?
No,
They
No.
were influenced by the scribes and Pharisees.
Okay, so if you took the scribes and the Pharisees out, would the crowd have shouted for Jesus' crucifixion?
in order for prophecy.
Don't know. Don't know. Not the way it's written. You know, the crowds yell what the scribes and the Pharisees tell them to yell, which you told me shows that they're wishy-washy, they don't have strong opinions, you know, they are the instigatees, those that are influenced. It's the scribes and the Pharisees that are the real bad guys because they're pushing them. The crowds just go along with the flow. For Matthew's church, and in fact for our church, who are the crowds? Who are the crowds? Who do you think are the crowds? What's that?
That's a good question.
Yes, I think it was. That's why I wrote it down. Who are the crowds? We know who the disciples are. Who are the disciples? Right now in the modern church, Sligo Presbyterian Church, who are the disciples?
The 12
The
children.
elders,
Well, the elders. Who else?
deacons,
Deacons. Who else?
pastor.
Pastor. Who else? I think everybody who's hearing it, because everybody who hears this is here, right? And there's a reason they're here. So when we read the Gospel of Matthew and we hear the Sermon on the Mount, which by the way Jesus gives to the disciples, right?
Yeah.
This is a message for us. This isn't a message for them, it's for us. So we are the disciples, right? Who are the scribes and the Pharisees for us? I mean, we're not dealing with scribes. I don't know that there's a scribe or a Pharisee that lives in Sligo. I don't think there's a Jew that lives in Sligo. Maybe. They're not talking about it. Who then for us become the scribes and the Pharisees? When we read this story, who do we identify as scribes and Pharisees? What did the scribes and the Pharisees do?
Judgmental people.
Okay, judgmental. What was their goal? What did they want? They wanted Jesus, and they wanted Jesus what? Gone, right? They wanted to get rid of him. So whoever we're facing that wants the church gone, closed, expired, no more. So you've got that group. You've got disciples in the church. Then who are the crowds? Who are the crowds right now?
The ones who don't live in good soil.
The ones who are just out there, right? The ones that can move in either direction, right? Depending on who's influencing them, right? Can move in one direction but can move in another. The people who are wishy-washy. The ones who are just there. They don't have faith, but they're amazed. They may like it, but they don't believe it. All the people who are there. People who, if we connect them to the parable of the sower, the ones who make up the field in which the seeds are scattered. Good, not so good. Soil that is good, soil that's not so good. Those who are just out there. I think that's the role the crowds play. And so when we read the gospel, if we kind of keep that in mind, all of a sudden it takes on a slightly different dimension. Or the way we interpret it changes a little bit. Okay, that's the crowds. Next week we're going to close this by talking about the rich young ruler and his friends. In other words, how does Jesus deal with people who have money? How does he deal with money and property? And there's a lot of stuff he talks about with that. Okay, let's have a word of prayer and then go home. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and remind us that as we look out these windows, man, we are looking into the crowds. And those crowds are, they're just people. They're easily influenced, so they flow back and forth. But they're also the field in which we have the opportunity to scatter seeds. And since we know they can be influenced, help us to influence them for the gospel. Help us to share the seeds in this field. Help us to enable them to be in a context where they can become disciples, where they can hear the call, where they can feel the Spirit. Help us to do that. In the name of Christ, amen. Amen. So thank you.